My son-in-law used to go fishing at the lake every night. One day I followed him and saw him throw a suitcase into the water, but I heard a muffled sound coming from inside. I ran to pull the suitcase out and forced the zipper open. I froze. What I saw inside made my blood run cold. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Harold, and at 64 years old I thought I'd seen enough of life to spot trouble when it walked through my front door. I was wrong. It started 3 months ago when my daughter Sarah married Charles. On paper, he seemed perfect. Handsome, well-spoken, with a decent job at the insurance company downtown. Sarah was glowing with happiness, finally settling down at 32 after years of failed relationships. I wanted to be happy for her, I really did, but something about Charles made my skin crawl from the very beginning. The first red flag came during their engagement dinner at my house. Charles was charming, almost too charming, complimenting everything from my wife Martha's pot roast to the way I'd arranged the living room furniture. But when Sarah excused herself to help Martha with dessert, his smile disappeared completely. He sat there staring at his phone, his jaw clenched tight like he was angry about something. The moment Sarah returned, that perfect smile snapped back into place. I mentioned it to Martha later that night, but she brushed off my concerns. "You're being overprotective, Harold," she said while brushing her teeth. "Sarah's happy, that's what matters. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was just having trouble letting go of my little girl." But then Charles started his nightly fishing trips. It began about 2 weeks after they moved into the small house on Maple Street, just 15 minutes from mine. Sarah called me one evening, her voice strained and tired. "Dad, could you come over tomorrow and help Charles fix the kitchen faucet? He's been so busy lately." "Busy with what?" I asked. There was a pause. "Work stuff. And he's been going fishing every night at Miller's Lake. He says it helps him relax." Every night seemed excessive for a man who claimed to be swamped with work, but I kept my mouth shut. The next day I spent 3 hours fixing a faucet that should have taken 30 minutes, mainly because I was watching Charles. He sat at the kitchen table, constantly checking his phone, typing furiously. When I asked about his fishing success, he gave me a blank stare. "Oh right, the fishing. Yeah, it's been quiet lately." For a man supposedly passionate enough about fishing to go every single night, he sure didn't seem enthusiastic about it. That's when I started paying closer attention to Sarah. My bright, confident daughter had become a shadow of herself. She'd lost at least 15 pounds since the wedding. Her clothes hanging loose on her small frame, dark circles under her eyes suggested she wasn't sleeping well. When I hugged her goodbye that day, I felt how tense her shoulders were, like she was constantly braced for something. "Sarah, honey, are you feeling all right? You look tired." She glanced nervously toward Charles, then back at me. "I'm fine, Dad. Just adjusting to married life, you know." But her smile didn't reach her eyes, and she wouldn't hold my gaze for more than a few seconds. The situation got worse over the following weeks. Sarah stopped calling me regularly, something she'd done every few days since she was 18 and moved out. When I called her, the conversations were stilted, uncomfortable. She'd answer my questions with short responses, always seeming distracted or rushed. "I should go, Dad. Charles will be home soon and I need to start dinner." "It's only 4 o'clock, I'd say, confused. He likes to eat early before his fishing trips. Those damned fishing trips. Every single night, like clockwork. Charles would come home from work, eat dinner, and head out to Miller's Lake with his tackle box and fishing rod. According to Sarah, he usually returned around midnight or later. But here's the thing that really bothered me. In 3 months of supposedly dedicated fishing, I never once saw him bring home a single fish. I know Miller's Lake well. I've been fishing there since I was 12 years old, and it's always been well stocked with bass, perch, and catfish. Even a mediocre fisherman should catch something occasionally. But Charles never had fish stories to tell, never asked to borrow my tackle, never even mentioned what kind of bait he was using. Martha thought I was being ridiculous. "Maybe he just enjoys the peace and quiet, Harold. Not everyone needs to catch fish to enjoy fishing." But my gut told me otherwise. Something was very wrong with this picture. The breaking point came last Tuesday. I'd stopped by Sarah's house around 7 in the evening to drop off some tomatoes from Martha's garden. Charles was loading his fishing gear into his car when I pulled into the driveway. "Evening, Charles, heading out to the lake?" He barely looked at me, just nodded and muttered something about the fish biting better after dark. But as I watched him drive away, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. His tackle box was sitting right there on the passenger seat, clearly visible through the window. It was bone dry. Not a drop of lake water on it, no mud on the bottom, no signs of recent use. For a man who supposedly spent several hours by the water every night, that tackle box looked like it had never left his garage. I found Sarah in the kitchen, mechanically washing dishes that were already clean. "Sarah, sweetheart, can we talk?" She froze, her hand still submerged in the soapy water. "About what, Dad?" "About how you're doing, really doing." For just a moment, I thought she might open up to me. Her lower lip trembled, and I could see tears forming in her eyes. But then she blinked them away and turned back to the sink. "I'm fine, Dad, everything's fine." But everything was not fine. I could feel it in my bones, the same instinct that had kept me alive during my 2 tours in Vietnam. Danger was circling my daughter like a shark, and I was the only one who seemed to notice. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to find out what Charles was really doing during those late-night trips to Miller's Lake. As I lay in bed next to Martha, listening to her peaceful breathing, I stared at the ceiling and planned my next move. Tomorrow night, I would follow Charles. Whatever he was hiding, whatever was making my daughter so frightened and withdrawn, I was going to uncover it. I had no idea that what I would discover would be far more disturbing than anything my worst fears had conjured up. The next evening, I told Martha I was going to bed early with a headache. She kissed my forehead and went back to her crossword puzzle, completely unaware that I was about to embark on what felt like the most important mission of my life. I waited in my darkened bedroom until I heard her turn off the television and brush her teeth. Once I was certain she was asleep, I slipped out of bed, dressed in dark clothes, and quietly made my way to my old pickup truck parked 2 blocks away. I'd moved it there earlier, knowing the sound of my engine starting in the driveway would wake Martha. My hands were shaking as I drove toward Sarah's neighborhood. At 64, I thought my days of nighttime surveillance were long behind me. But here I was, my heart pounding like I was back in the jungles of Southeast Asia. I parked on Oak Street, 1 block over from Maple, where I had a clear view of Charles and Sarah's house through the trees. Their porch light was on, and I could see Charles's car in the driveway. According to Sarah, he usually left around 8:30. It was 8:15. The minutes crawled by. I found myself gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. What if I was wrong? What if Charles really was just fishing, and I was letting my paranoia turn me into some kind of crazy old man spying on his son-in-law? But then I thought about Sarah's haunted eyes, her trembling hands, the way she flinched whenever Charles spoke to her. No, I wasn't crazy. Something was very wrong. At exactly 8:32, Charles emerged from the house carrying his fishing rod and tackle box. Even from a distance, I could see that mechanical way he moved, like he was going through motions rather than actually preparing for an activity he enjoyed. He threw his gear into the back of his sedan and drove off. I waited until his taillights disappeared around the corner, then started my engine and followed. The drive to Miller's Lake took about 20 minutes. I stayed far enough back to avoid being spotted, but close enough to keep his car in sight. My palms were sweating despite the cool October air, and I kept second-guessing myself with every mile. Miller's Lake was a popular fishing spot during the day, but at night it was usually deserted except for the occasional teenager looking for a secluded place to park with their girlfriend. Charles drove past the main parking area where most fishermen set up and continued around to the far side of the lake, where the road became a narrow dirt path barely wide enough for 1 car. I killed my headlights and followed at a distance, using the moonlight to navigate. My truck's engine seemed impossibly loud in the quiet night, and I was certain Charles would hear me coming. But he seemed focused on reaching his destination. He finally stopped at a small clearing I remembered from my childhood. My grandfather used to take me there to fish for catfish in the deeper water. It was isolated, surrounded by thick woods with no nearby houses or streetlights. I parked behind a cluster of pine trees about 200 yards away and turned off my engine. The silence was immediately overwhelming. No traffic, no voices, just the gentle lapping of water against the shore and the distant hoot of an owl. Charles got out of his car, but instead of setting up his fishing equipment, he went straight to his trunk. My heart started racing as I watched him pull out a large black suitcase. Not a cooler, not additional fishing gear, a suitcase. He dragged it toward the water's edge, struggling with its weight. Even from my distant hiding spot, I could tell the suitcase was heavy, requiring him to use both hands and lean backward to counterbalance. What I saw next made my blood freeze in my veins. Charles lifted the suitcase and hurled it as far as he could into the dark water. The splash echoed across the lake like a gunshot in the quiet night. But just as the suitcase hit the water and began to sink, I heard something that nearly stopped my heart. A muffled sound. A rhythmic thumping, like something was moving inside that suitcase. Something alive. "Dear God," I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. Charles stood at the water's edge for a moment, watching the ripples spread across the lake's surface. Then he calmly walked back to his car, retrieved his fishing rod, and set up as if nothing had happened. I sat frozen in my truck, my mind racing. What had I just witnessed? What was in that suitcase? And why did it sound like whatever was inside had been struggling? Every instinct I had was screaming at me to call the police, but what would I tell them? That my son-in-law threw a suitcase in a lake and I heard a noise. They'd think I was a paranoid old man who'd been watching too many crime shows. But I knew what I'd heard. Something had been alive in that suitcase, and now it was at the bottom of Miller's Lake. I watched Charles for another hour, but he just sat there with his fishing line in the water, occasionally reeling in and casting out again. To anyone passing by, he would look like exactly what he claimed to be, a man enjoying some peaceful night fishing. But I knew better now. This wasn't about fishing. This was about getting rid of evidence. And whatever had been in that suitcase, whatever had made that terrible muffled sound as it sank beneath the surface, was connected to my daughter's strange behavior. As I drove home, my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I kept replaying the sound in my mind, that rhythmic thumping that suggested something desperate and alive. The weight of the suitcase, the way Charles had struggled to carry it, the casual manner in which he'd thrown it into the deep water. Back home, Martha was still sleeping soundly. I slipped into bed beside her, but sleep was impossible. I stared at the ceiling, my mind churning with horrible possibilities. What kind of man had my daughter married, and what was he doing every night at that lake? By morning, I'd made a decision that terrified me as much as it gave me purpose. I was going back to Miller's Lake, and I was going to find that suitcase, whatever Charles had thrown into those dark waters. Whatever secret he was literally trying to bury, I was going to drag it back to the surface. Even if it meant diving into the cold October waters myself, even if what I found inside changed everything I thought I knew about my family forever. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that muffled sound echoing in my mind. Rhythmic, desperate, alive. By 5 in the morning, I gave up trying to rest and made my way to the kitchen for coffee. Martha found me there an hour later, staring blankly at the newspaper without reading a single word. "Harold, you look terrible. Are you coming down with something?" I forced a smile. "Just didn't sleep well. I think I'll take a drive later, get some fresh air." She nodded, already distracted by her morning routine. Martha had always been trusting, never questioning my need for solitude when I was working through a problem. It was one of the things I loved most about our 41-year marriage, and one of the things that made lying to her feel like acid in my stomach. I spent the morning gathering supplies. From my garage, I retrieved my old diving mask and snorkel from our Florida vacation 3 years ago. I hadn't used them since, but they were still in good condition. I also found a length of rope, a flashlight in a waterproof case, and my thick winter gloves. The drive back to Miller's Lake felt different in daylight. What had seemed ominous and secretive the night before now looked like an ordinary fishing spot. A few early morning anglers were already set up along the main shore, their lines cast into the calm water. I nodded politely as I drove past, trying to look like just another fisherman heading to his favorite secluded spot. I parked in the same clearing where Charles had been the night before. In daylight, I could see the tire tracks from his car, the disturbed earth where he'd dragged that heavy suitcase. The evidence of what I'd witnessed was right there, but it would mean nothing to anyone who hadn't seen what I'd seen. The water was clearer than I'd expected, but still deep enough that I couldn't see the bottom from the shore. I estimated Charles had thrown the suitcase about 30 feet out, in a section where the lake bed dropped off sharply. I stripped down to my underwear, pulled on the diving mask, and waded into the cold October water. The shock of the temperature nearly sent me back to shore, but I forced myself to continue. My daughter's safety depended on finding out what Charles had thrown into this lake. The first few dives were unsuccessful. The water was murky near the bottom, filled with decades of accumulated leaves and sediment. My aging body wasn't designed for this kind of physical exertion anymore, and I had to surface frequently to catch my breath. On my 7th dive, my fingers brushed against something hard and artificial. My heart hammered as I traced the outline with my hands, rectangular, with metal clasps and a handle. The suitcase. It took 3 more attempts to work it free from the mud and debris that had already begun to settle around it. The weight was enormous underwater, but manageable with the buoyancy helping me. I dragged it toward shore, my lungs burning with the effort. When I finally hauled it onto the muddy bank, I collapsed beside it, gasping and shivering. The black leather was expensive-looking with brass hardware that had already begun to tarnish from the lake water, but it was what I could feel moving slightly inside as I dragged it that made my blood run cold. Whatever was in there was still moving. With trembling fingers, I worked at the clasps. They were locked, but the lake water had already begun to weaken the mechanism. Using a rock, I pounded at the locks until they finally gave way. I lifted the lid and immediately staggered backward, my stomach lurching. The suitcase was filled with documents, photographs, and what appeared to be recording equipment. But that wasn't what made me sick. It was the small cage tucked into one corner, with a terrified tabby cat crammed inside, barely alive and clearly traumatized. "Oh my God," I whispered, reaching for the cage with shaking hands. The cat was weak but breathing. Its fur was matted and wet, and it barely reacted when I opened the small cage door. But it was alive. That rhythmic thumping I'd heard had been this poor creature trying to claw its way out of its prison as the suitcase sank into the dark water. Who puts a live cat in a suitcase and throws it into a lake? What kind of monster was my daughter married to? But as horrifying as the discovery of the cat was, it was just the beginning. While the animal recovered on a towel beside me, I began examining the other contents of the suitcase. The documents were in waterproof plastic bags which had protected them from the lake water. As I spread them out on the ground, my horror deepened with each page I read. There were copies of bank statements, not Charles's, but belonging to at least a dozen different people in town, people I recognized. Mrs. Henderson from the grocery store, Tom Bradley, who ran the hardware store, even Pastor Williams from the Methodist Church. But these weren't just random financial documents. Someone had highlighted specific transactions, made notes in the margins, circled suspicious amounts. It looked like evidence of financial improprieties, but as I studied them more closely, I realized many of the highlighted items were perfectly innocent. Mortgage payments, medical bills, charity donations. The photographs were even more disturbing. They showed people in compromising situations, nothing illegal but embarrassing. Tom Bradley arguing with his wife in their front yard, Mrs. Henderson's teenage son sneaking out of the house late at night, Pastor Williams meeting privately with a female parishioner. Each photograph was accompanied by typed notes speculating about what might be happening. Innocent situations twisted into something sinister through careful observation and malicious interpretation. At the bottom of the suitcase, I found a leather-bound notebook. The handwriting inside was Charles's. I recognized it from the thank you card he'd sent after the wedding. Page after page detailed the private lives of our neighbors, their financial situations, their personal problems, their secrets, both real and imagined. But it was the section about my own family that made me physically ill. Charles had been watching us for months before he even started dating Sarah. He knew about my military pension, about Martha's small inheritance from her mother, about the $15,000 we'd put aside for home repairs. He'd researched Sarah's job, her previous relationships, even her medical history. And then I found the photographs of Sarah. They were taken without her knowledge, through windows in parking lots at her workplace. Dozens of them documenting her daily routine, her habits, her vulnerabilities. The handwriting beside them was clinical, calculating. Subject shows signs of low self-esteem following previous relationship failures. Responds well to attention and validation. Financial situation stable but not wealthy. Likely to be impressed by displays of success. Relationship with father appears close but complicated. Potential leverage point. I felt bile rise in my throat as I read Charles's analysis of my daughter, like she was some kind of target to be acquired. The final section of the notebook contained what could only be described as a master plan. Charles had identified 12 families in our small town, all with modest savings or valuable assets. He'd spent months researching their weaknesses, their secrets, their pressure points. The plan was simple and terrifying. Marry into one family to establish credibility and gain access to social circles. Use that access to gather compromising information about others, then systematically blackmail them for money, using their secrets and manufactured evidence to ensure compliance. Sarah wasn't his wife. She was his entry point into our community. As I sat there beside the muddy lake, shivering in my wet underwear with a traumatized cat beside me, the full scope of what I'd discovered hit me like a physical blow. Charles wasn't just a bad husband or even a simple con man. He was a predator who had targeted our entire town, and he was using my daughter as his unwitting accomplice. But why the cat? Why throw a live animal into the lake? I found the answer in the final pages of the notebook. The cat belonged to Mrs. Patterson, the elderly widow who lived alone on Pine Street. Charles had been trying to pressure her into giving him access to her late husband's life insurance money. When she'd refused and threatened to call the police, he'd stolen her beloved pet as leverage. But something had gone wrong. Maybe Mrs. Patterson had called his bluff. Maybe she'd contacted the authorities anyway. So Charles had decided to get rid of the evidence and send a message. The methodical cruelty of it made me understand that my daughter was in more danger than I'd ever imagined. If Charles was willing to kill an innocent animal to cover his tracks, what would he do to Sarah if she became a liability? I carefully repacked everything except the cat, sealed the suitcase as best I could, and hid it in the trunk of my truck. The cat, weak but alive, I wrapped in my jacket and placed on the passenger seat. As I drove toward the animal hospital, my mind raced with the implications of what I'd found. Charles wasn't just manipulating Sarah, he was using her marriage to him as a shield while he systematically destroyed the lives of everyone in our community. And I was the only one who knew the truth. Dr. Martinez at the animal hospital didn't ask many questions when I brought in the half-drowned cat, claiming I'd found it by the lake. She was more concerned with treating the animal's hypothermia and dehydration than investigating how it got there. "She'll be fine," Dr. Martinez assured me after examining the cat. "Scared and traumatized, but physically she should recover completely. Do you know who she belongs to?" I nodded. "Mrs. Patterson on Pine Street. Her cat went missing a few days ago. Well, she's lucky you found her when you did. A few more hours in that cold water and we'd be having a different conversation." As I drove home, the cat sleeping peacefully in her carrier on the passenger seat, I couldn't stop thinking about Charles's notebook, the methodical way he'd studied our community, identified targets, planned his attacks. This wasn't the work of some desperate man who'd stumbled into crime. This was the work of someone who saw other people as nothing more than resources to be exploited. But it was the section about Sarah that haunted me most. Reading Charles's clinical analysis of my daughter, seeing how he'd identified her vulnerabilities and crafted his approach accordingly, made me feel sick with rage and helplessness. I needed to understand the full scope of what he was doing before I could figure out how to stop him. After dropping the cat off with a tearfully grateful Mrs. Patterson, who hugged me so tightly I thought my ribs might crack, I went home and told Martha I was going to spend the afternoon organizing the garage. Instead, I locked myself in there with Charles's waterlogged notebook and began making a list. 12 families. 12 sets of financial documents, 12 collections of photographs and personal information. Charles had been busy. The Hendersons owned the only grocery store in town, a family business that had been struggling since the big chain store opened 20 miles away. According to Charles's notes, they'd been skimming small amounts from the register to make ends meet. Nothing major, just enough to pay their bills while they tried to keep the store afloat. Charles had somehow documented this, photographed the discrepancies, and was demanding $2,000 a month to keep quiet. Tom Bradley's hardware store was in a similar situation. His elderly father had Alzheimer's and required expensive care that insurance wouldn't fully cover. Tom had been inflating some insurance claims to help pay for his father's treatment. Again, Charles had evidence, and Tom was paying $1,500 monthly for his silence. Pastor Williams's situation was more complex. The photographs Charles had taken showed the pastor meeting privately with Janet Morrison, a married woman in the congregation. The meetings were innocent. Janet was struggling with depression and had been seeking counseling, but Charles had framed them to look like an affair. He was bleeding the church's emergency fund dry, demanding $3,000 a month while Pastor Williams desperately tried to keep the congregation from learning about the supposed scandal. One by one, I went through Charles's victims: a retired teacher whose pension wasn't enough to cover her husband's cancer treatments, a young couple trying to hide their financial struggles from their judgmental families, a widower who'd been caring for his disabled adult son without help. All good people, all vulnerable people, all being systematically destroyed by my son-in-law. But the most chilling discovery was how Charles had inserted himself into their lives before revealing what he knew. He'd joined the church just to get close to Pastor Williams. He'd become a regular at the hardware store, building a friendship with Tom Bradley. He'd even volunteered to help Mrs. Henderson with her bookkeeping, giving him access to the very records he'd later use against her. He was like a cancer, growing slowly and invisibly until it was too late for his victims to cut him out of their lives. The financial records showed that Charles was collecting nearly $20,000 a month from his various schemes. No wonder he could afford to quit his insurance job after just 2 months of marriage. His real career was destroying the lives of honest people. But what terrified me most was realizing how he'd positioned Sarah in all of this. According to his notes, Sarah had unknowingly provided him with crucial information about several of his targets: casual conversations about church gossip, complaints about poor service at local businesses, innocent observations about neighbors' behavior. Charles had weaponized every piece of information she'd shared. She'd mentioned that Pastor Williams had been looking tired lately, worried about something. Charles had used that information to time his approach, catching the pastor when he was most vulnerable to manipulation. She'd complained about Mrs. Henderson being short-tempered at the store, not knowing that the woman was already being bled dry by her husband's blackmail scheme. Sarah wasn't just an entry point into the community. She was an unwitting intelligence source, and Charles was using her kind heart and natural concern for others as tools in his campaign of terror. The worst part was understanding how trapped she'd become. Charles had made sure she was financially dependent on him, encouraging her to quit her part-time job at the library so she could focus on being a good wife. He'd isolated her from her friends, subtly discouraging her from maintaining relationships that might interfere with his work. He'd even been feeding her small doses of anxiety medication. I found the empty bottles hidden in a box marked fishing supplies to keep her compliant and confused. My strong, independent daughter had been systematically broken down into someone who was afraid to make any decision without Charles's approval. But it was the final section of the notebook that made me realize just how much danger Sarah was in. Charles had been documenting her behavior, her moods, her questions. He was watching her just as carefully as he watched his victims, looking for signs that she might be becoming suspicious or unreliable. Subject becoming more withdrawn and questioning. Asked about bank account balance twice this week. Maybe noticing discrepancies in stated versus actual income. Recommend increased monitoring and possible intervention if behavior continues. The clinical detachment in his writing about my daughter made my hands shake with rage. He was talking about her like she was a problem to be managed, not the woman he'd pledged to love and protect. And possible intervention, what did that mean? I thought about the cat, barely alive after being thrown into the lake. I thought about Mrs. Patterson's tears when she'd hugged her rescued pet. Charles had been willing to kill an innocent animal just to send a message to one stubborn victim. What would he do to Sarah if she became too much of a liability? I spent the rest of the afternoon cross-referencing the notebook with public records, verifying what I could. Everything checked out. The addresses, the family situations, the financial details. Charles had done his homework thoroughly, but I also discovered something that gave me hope. Several of his victims had been trying to fight back, in small ways. Tom Bradley had started keeping his real books at home instead of at the store. Mrs. Henderson had begun making her deposits at a bank in the next town over, where Charles couldn't easily monitor them. Pastor Williams had quietly reached out to the bishop about his situation, though he hadn't been able to explain the full truth. People were starting to notice that something was wrong. They were beginning to resist, even if they didn't fully understand what they were resisting against. But they needed help. They needed someone who could see the full picture, who could connect the dots between their individual struggles and the man who was orchestrating them all. They needed someone who could expose Charles without putting Sarah in greater danger. As evening approached, I realized I had to make a choice. I could take everything to the police, but that would mean exposing Sarah's unwitting role in her husband's crimes. Even if she wasn't legally culpable, the shame and guilt would destroy her. Or I could try to handle this myself, the way I'd handled problems in the war when official channels weren't available or reliable. Martha called me to dinner, her voice carrying from the kitchen with its familiar warmth and normalcy. I looked at the evidence spread across my workbench, proof that a monster had been living among us using my daughter as a shield while he destroyed lives for money. Charles thought he was untouchable. He thought his careful planning and methodical approach had made him invincible. He was about to learn what happened when a predator made the mistake of threatening a soldier's family. I began planning my own campaign, one that would free Sarah and our community from Charles's web of manipulation without destroying the innocent people he'd trapped along the way. But first I had to figure out how to save my daughter without losing her forever. The plan came to me over the course of 3 sleepless nights. It had to be surgical, precise, and most importantly, it had to protect Sarah from the fallout. She couldn't know what her husband really was until I had already neutralized the threat he posed. I started with Mrs. Patterson. "Harold, I can't thank you enough for finding Whiskers," she said when I visited her 2 days later, ostensibly to check on the cat's recovery, "but I have to tell you something strange. The night before she disappeared, I could have sworn I saw someone in my backyard. When I called out, they ran away." I nodded sympathetically, letting her talk while I studied her living room. Charles's notebook had been accurate. She lived alone in a house worth at least $300,000, with photographs of her late husband in his Navy uniform displayed prominently on the mantel. "Mrs. Patterson, has anyone approached you recently about financial matters? Insurance, investments, anything like that?" Her face darkened. "That son-in-law of yours, actually. Charles. He came by about a month ago, said he was expanding his insurance business, and wanted to help me review my policies. Nice young man, but very pushy. He kept asking about Edgar's life insurance, wanted to see the paperwork. And did you show it to him?" "At first, yes. I thought I was being neighborly, but then he started suggesting I could get better returns if I let him invest some of the money. When I said I wasn't interested, he got persistent. Started calling every day, showing up unannounced. Finally, I told him to leave me alone or I'd call the police. That's when Whiskers disappeared. She nodded, fresh tears forming in her eyes. The very next day. I thought it was just coincidence, but now. Harold, you don't think he would have hurt my cat, do you? I patted her shoulder gently. I think some people will do terrible things when they're desperate, Mrs. Patterson, but Whiskers is safe now, and I promise you won't be bothered by Charles again. She looked at me with hope and confusion. How can you promise that? Because I'm going to have a conversation with him. My next stop was Pastor Williams. I found him in his office at the church looking haggard and defeated. The man who had baptized Sarah 28 years ago now looked like he'd aged a decade in the past few months. Harold, good to see you. How's the family? That's what I wanted to talk to you about, Pastor. Specifically about Charles. The color drained from his face. Charles? I'm not sure I understand. I sat down across from his desk and spoke quietly. I know about the money, Pastor. I know about the photographs. I know what he's been doing to you. Pastor Williams's hands began to shake. Harold, I can explain. You don't need to explain anything to me. You were trying to help someone who was suffering, and Charles twisted that into something ugly. That's what predators do. He broke down then, sobbing into his hands like a broken man. He said he'd destroy the church, Harold. Said he'd send those pictures to the bishop, to the newspapers. Janet Morrison was just trying to get help for her depression, but the way he photographed us, it looks like something it never was. I know, and I'm going to fix this. How? He has copies of everything. Even if you could get the originals, he could have made dozens of duplicates. Let me worry about that. Right now, I need you to do exactly what I tell you. Over the next hour, I outlined my plan to Pastor Williams. His role would be crucial, but relatively simple. All he had to do was trust me and follow my instructions exactly. I spent the next 2 days making similar visits to Tom Bradley, Mrs. Henderson, and 3 other victims I could identify from Charles's notebook. The conversations were painful. Watching good people break down as they admitted to being blackmailed was like seeing my neighbors stripped of their dignity. But each one agreed to help once they understood they weren't alone. The hardest part was keeping everything from Martha and Sarah. Martha knew something was troubling me, but she'd learned over 41 years of marriage to give me space to work through problems in my own way. Sarah, meanwhile, had become so withdrawn and medicated that she barely seemed to notice anything beyond her immediate surroundings. On Thursday evening, exactly 1 week after I'd followed Charles to the lake, I put the final phase of my plan into motion. I waited until Charles left for his nightly fishing trip, then called Sarah. Dad, is everything okay? You sound strange. I'm fine, honey. But I need to ask you to do something for me. And it's very important that you do exactly what I say. Okay. Her voice was hesitant, confused. I need you to pack a bag with enough clothes for a few days and come stay with your mother and me. Don't ask questions, don't call Charles, just pack and come over right now. Dad, I can't just leave. Charles will be home around midnight and he expects... Sarah. I put all the authority of 40 years of being her father into my voice. Trust me, come home, now. 20 minutes later, she was standing in our living room with a small overnight bag, looking lost and frightened. Martha fussed over her, immediately noticing how thin and pale she'd become. Harold, what's going on? Martha demanded. Sarah looks like she's been ill. I took both of their hands and led them to the couch. I need you both to listen to me very carefully. Sarah, your husband is not the man you think he is. He's dangerous, and you're not safe with him. Sarah's eyes widened. Dad, that's crazy. Charles would never hurt me. He loves me. I pulled out a manila folder containing copies of the most damning pages from Charles's notebook. He's been using you, sweetheart. This whole marriage was part of a plan to steal money from people in our community. As I walked them through the evidence, watching Sarah's face crumble with each revelation, I felt like I was performing surgery on my own heart. Every detail that proved Charles's manipulation was another wound to her already fragile psyche. The anxiety medication he's been giving you, I continued gently, it wasn't prescribed by your doctor. He's been drugging you to keep you compliant and confused. Martha gasped. Harold, how do you know all this? Because I followed him. I saw what he was doing and I found his records. By the time I finished explaining, Sarah was sobbing in Martha's arms. How could I be so stupid? How did I not see it? Because he's a professional manipulator, honey. He studies people, finds their weaknesses, and exploits them. You're not stupid. You're a victim. But what about all those people he's been hurting? Mrs. Henderson, Pastor Williams, they must hate me. They must think I was part of it. They know you weren't. I've talked to them. They understand that you were being used just like they were. Martha looked at me with a mixture of admiration and concern. Harold, what exactly are you planning to do about this? Before I could answer, my phone rang. Charles's number. Don't answer it, Sarah whispered, instinctively afraid. No, I said, accepting the call. It's time. Harold? Is Sarah there? She's not home, and her car is in the driveway. I'm worried something might have happened to her. His voice was smooth, concerned, perfectly calibrated to sound like a worried husband. Even knowing what I knew, I could hear how he'd fooled my daughter. She's here, Charles. She's safe. A pause. Oh, good. Well, could you ask her to come home? I was hoping to surprise her with dinner when I got back from fishing. She won't be coming home, Charles. In fact, she won't be seeing you again. Another pause, longer this time. When he spoke again, the concerned husband mask had slipped slightly. I'm not sure I understand. I think you do. I know about the blackmail, Charles. I know about the money you've been stealing. I know about Mrs. Patterson's cat. The silence stretched so long I thought he might have hung up. Finally, he spoke, and his voice was completely different now. Cold, calculating, dangerous. You don't know what you're playing with, old man. You have no idea what I'm capable of. Actually, I do. I've read your notebook. I know exactly what you're capable of. My notebook? For the first time, he sounded genuinely shaken. The one you threw into Miller's Lake along with that poor cat. Did you really think drowning an innocent animal would scare Mrs. Patterson into submission? I could hear his breathing on the other end of the line, rapid and shallow. Sarah and Martha were watching me with wide eyes, holding each other tightly on the couch. Here's what's going to happen, Charles, I continued. You're going to disappear. Tonight. You're going to take whatever money you have and leave town, and you're never going to contact Sarah or anyone else in this community again. And if I refuse? Then tomorrow morning, copies of your notebook and all your evidence files will be delivered to the FBI, the state police, and the district attorney's office, along with a full confession from every one of your victims, documented proof of your blackmail schemes, and testimony about your animal cruelty. You're bluffing. Those people won't testify against me. They have too much to lose. They already have. Signed statements, witnessed and notarized. Turns out when people discover they're not alone, when they realize they're all victims of the same predator, they find their courage pretty quickly. The silence stretched again. I could practically hear him calculating, weighing his options, trying to find an angle he could exploit. What about Sarah? She's my wife. I have legal rights. I looked at my daughter still sobbing quietly in her mother's arms and felt a cold rage settle in my chest. Your marriage was based on fraud and coercion. Sarah will be filing for an annulment, citing mental incapacity due to the drugs you were giving her without her knowledge. You'll be lucky if she doesn't press criminal charges. This isn't over, Harold. Yes, it is. You have until sunrise to be gone, Charles. If I see you in this town after that, if you make any attempt to contact Sarah or any of your other victims, I'll make sure you spend the rest of your life in prison. I hung up and looked at my wife and daughter. Sarah had stopped crying and was staring at me with something like awe. Dad, what if he doesn't leave? What if he tries to hurt someone? I smiled grimly. Then he'll discover that some old soldiers never really retire. Charles was gone by dawn. I knew because I'd spent the night in my truck, parked where I could watch both his house and the main roads out of town. At 4:30 in the morning, I saw him load 2 suitcases into his car and drive away without looking back. I followed him for 20 miles until he merged onto the interstate heading south. Only then did I allow myself to believe that the first phase of my plan had actually worked. When I returned home, Martha was making coffee and Sarah was sitting at the kitchen table, looking more alert than she had in months. The fog of whatever Charles had been giving her was finally starting to clear. Is he gone? Sarah asked quietly. I nodded. He won't be back. She was quiet for a long moment, then looked up at me with tears in her eyes. Dad, I need to ask you something and I need you to tell me the truth. Of course. Did I help him hurt those people? When I told him things about our neighbors, about what was happening in their lives, was I part of what he was doing to them? I sat down beside her and took her hand. Sarah, honey, you were talking to your husband. You thought you were sharing harmless gossip with someone who loved you. There's no way you could have known he was using that information to hurt people. But I should have seen what kind of person he was. I should have known. Stop. I squeezed her hand. Charles is a professional manipulator. He spent months studying you before he even introduced himself. He knew exactly what to say, how to act, what buttons to push. You're not responsible for being fooled by someone who made a career out of fooling people. Martha set a cup of coffee in front of each of us and sat down. Harold's right, sweetheart. That man was a predator. You're not the first intelligent woman to be taken in by someone like that, and you won't be the last. Over the next few hours, as the medication worked its way out of Sarah's system, she began to remember things more clearly. Charles's controlling behavior, his insistence that she quit her job, his anger whenever she spent time with friends or family. the pattern of isolation and dependency that she'd rationalized as love and protectiveness. "I feel so stupid," she said, burying her face in her hands. "You're not stupid. You're recovering. There's a difference." The healing process wasn't quick or easy. Sarah moved back home for 6 weeks while she regained her physical and emotional strength. She started seeing a therapist who specialized in psychological abuse, and slowly began to understand how thoroughly Charles had manipulated her. The annulment process was surprisingly straightforward once we presented evidence of the fraud and coercion involved in the marriage. Charles didn't contest it, probably because fighting it would have meant returning to face the criminal charges that were still waiting for him if he ever showed his face in our state again. But the most satisfying part came 3 weeks after Charles left town. I was working in my garage when Pastor William stopped by, looking like a completely different man than the broken soul I'd spoken with in his office. "Harold, I wanted to thank you again. The church council met last night, and when I explained what had really been happening, with your permission to share the evidence, they were nothing but supportive. How's Janet Morrison doing?" "Much better. Her husband knows the truth now about why she was meeting with me, and he's been incredibly understanding. She's getting proper treatment for her depression, and their marriage is actually stronger than it's been in years." "And the money?" Pastor Williams smiled. "Funny thing about that. When people learned what Charles had been doing, how he'd been bleeding our emergency fund dry, the congregation rallied. We've already received enough donations to replace what he stole, plus enough to help some of the other families he was targeting." Similar conversations happened throughout the following weeks. Tom Bradley's insurance situation was resolved when he came clean about the inflated claims and worked out a payment plan with the company. Mrs. Henderson received an outpouring of community support when word got out about her struggles to keep the store afloat, not through gossip or shame, but through people who wanted to help. It turned out that once Charles's web of secrecy and intimidation was broken, our small community was more than capable of taking care of its own. The most difficult part was helping Sarah process her guilt about the role she'd unknowingly played. Even though everyone understood she'd been a victim, she struggled to forgive herself for the information she'd inadvertently provided. "Dad, when I told Charles about Mrs. Henderson looking tired and stressed, he used that to time his approach. When I mentioned that Pastor Williams had been working late and seemed worried about something, Charles saw that as an opportunity. How do I live with that? The same way soldiers live with the fact that sometimes innocent people get hurt in war, even when we're trying to do the right thing. You focus on what you can control moving forward, not what you couldn't control in the past." She started volunteering at the church, helping with the food bank and visiting elderly members of the congregation. It was her way of giving back to the community Charles had harmed, and Pastor Williams said her help had been invaluable. Martha and I were amazed by our daughter's resilience. The woman who had been so broken and withdrawn just months before was emerging stronger and more confident than ever. She got her job back at the library, started taking night classes at the community college, and even began dating again, though she was understandably cautious about trusting too quickly. 6 months after Charles disappeared, Sarah moved into her own apartment. It was small but comfortable, and she decorated it with bright colors and plants, a complete contrast to the sterile, controlled environment Charles had created for her. "I love having my own space again," she told me as we carried the last of her boxes upstairs. I'd forgotten what it felt like to make decisions without asking permission. "How are you sleeping?" I asked. She'd struggled with nightmares for months after learning the truth about her marriage. "Better. The therapist says it's normal for recovery to have ups and downs, but overall I'm getting stronger." We were arranging books on her new shelf when she turned to me with a serious expression. "Dad, I need to tell you something." "What's that?" "I know what you did for me, for all of us, was dangerous. Charles could have tried to hurt you, or Martha, or me. You risked everything to save people you didn't even know that well." I shrugged. "They were my neighbors. You were my daughter. That's what you do for family." She hugged me tightly. "I love you, Dad, and I'm sorry I ever doubted that you'd be there when I needed you. You never have to doubt that, sweetheart. Never." A year later, Sarah remarried, this time to David, a kind man she'd met at her night class. The wedding was small and simple, held in our backyard with just close family and friends. Pastor Williams performed the ceremony, and Mrs. Henderson provided flowers from her garden. As I walked Sarah down the makeshift aisle, she squeezed my arm and whispered, "This time feels real." I squeezed back. "That's because this time, you're choosing from a position of strength, not desperation." David was nothing like Charles. He encouraged Sarah's independence, celebrated her successes, and treated her like an equal partner rather than a possession to be controlled. When she told him the story of her first marriage, he listened with compassion and anger. Anger at Charles, not at her. "I'm grateful," he told me at their wedding reception. "Not for what she went through, but for how strong it made her. She knows who she is now, and she won't let anyone take that away from her again." I never heard from Charles again. Sometimes I wondered if he'd found another small town to terrorize, another vulnerable woman to manipulate, but I'd done what I could to protect the people I loved. The rest was up to others. Martha and I grew closer through the experience. She'd been shaken by how close we'd come to losing Sarah, and by the realization that evil could wear such a familiar face. But she was also proud of how I'd handled the situation, and amazed by the strength our community had shown when it came together. "You saved more than just Sarah," she told me one evening as we sat on our porch watching the sunset. "You saved all of us." "We saved ourselves," I corrected her. "I just helped everyone realize they weren't alone." 2 years later, I was diagnosed with early-stage prostate cancer. The treatment was successful, but it made me acutely aware of how precious time was and how important it was to use whatever years I had left wisely. Sarah was there for every doctor's appointment, every treatment session. She'd drive down from her new home 3 towns over, where she and David had moved for his job. She'd hold my hand during the difficult moments and celebrate with me during the good ones. "Remember when I said you didn't know how to take care of me?" she asked one day as we waited for test results. I nodded. It still stung, even knowing now why she'd said it. "I was so wrong, Dad. You've been taking care of me my whole life, even when I couldn't see it. Even when I didn't deserve it. You always deserved it, Sarah. You just couldn't accept it for a while." She squeezed my hand. "I can now." The doctor came in with the results. The treatment had been completely successful. As Sarah hugged me and cried with relief, I realized something important. Charles had tried to destroy our family by exploiting its weaknesses. Instead, he'd ended up making us stronger by forcing us to confront those weaknesses honestly. Sarah had learned to trust her own judgment again. Martha had learned that sometimes the people closest to us need our fierce protection, and I had learned that the warrior instincts I'd developed in Vietnam weren't just for war, they were for protecting the people who mattered most. Standing in that doctor's office, holding my daughter while she cried tears of joy and relief, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. Charles had tried to break us apart, but in the end, he'd only proven how unbreakable we really were. Some bonds can't be severed by manipulation or fear. Some families can't be destroyed by predators who mistake kindness for weakness, and some fathers will do whatever it takes to protect their children no matter the cost.